up and welcome to my review of the Zephyrus G14. This laptop is tailored specifically for people that want the most performance in an ultra portable, slim and light package. And I gotta say, this thing really delivers in a big way. Now, while this laptop is certainly awesome and very attractive in many ways, I don't think it's the ideal laptop suited to everyone. So I'm going to have a couple alternative recommendations at the end of this video. I'll have two big tricks for you in this video. One on how to significantly reduce the temperatures while maintaining the vast majority of performance in the laptop. And number two, how to improve the speaker quality with just a couple of clicks. So under the hood, we have a Ryzen 9 5900HS. This is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. Now it's rated for 35 watts, but Asus has tuned this to go to 50.1 watts of power when under a dual load stress test and 64.1 watts of power when under a CPU only load. Now the RTX 3060 pulls 59.7 watts under a dual load and 80.5 watts of power when under a GPU primary load. Now keep in mind this is with Timespy and with the turbo fan profile selected. When under manual mode, I only saw 59.5 watts of power on average. So interestingly enough, you may get a little bit more GPU performance out of turbo mode than out of manual mode, which is kind of weird. And that included a noticeable bump up in Timespy score compared to my actual live benchmarking where I was testing in manual mode. Now the 1080p 144Hz display has 329 nits brightness, 95% sRGB coverage, and 73% Adobe RGB coverage, as well as P3 color gamut. Now the display is bright enough, colorful enough, and has enough contrast to be a great gaming display, as well as to create content on. That said, there are more colorful displays on the market, and if this display had any weakness, it's that it definitely has some ghosting. Not too bad, but it is noticeable to someone who is very competitive. So if you're a hyper competitive gamer, I definitely recommend getting something with a higher response rate display. Now, I'm a very competitive gamer. I play a lot of esports games, so this laptop display probably wouldn't work very well for me. That said, if you're more of a casual gamer, you probably won't even notice the ghosting on the display because it's that minor. Now, we have 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 megahertz RAM, and one of the sticks is soldered and the other one is upgradable. So if you need more RAM and you want dual channel memory, you're gonna have to go somewhere else. Now, it comes with a 1 terabyte PCIe SSD, and there is no extra M.2 slot. We have a 76 watt-hour battery. It weighs 3.7 pounds and is 0.7 inches thin, much smaller than every other laptop I've tested so far this year. Now for Timespy, we got 7,465 on the turbo fan profile, while under manual mode, we only got 6,800 or so. So know that you're gonna get better GPU boosting potential in the turbo mode and not the manual mode, though I did all of my game testing in the manual mode and I found this out after the fact. So know that you might be able to get a little bit more performance in GPU bound games using the turbo fan profile. Now, when you compare this performance to last year's Zephyrus G14, we get a 36% performance increase in the same chassis. Now, keep in mind, this is also with dynamic boost, and when you're not using dynamic boost, you only get 6,800 points right there at the 60 watt limit. Now for Timespy points per pound, we got 2018, which is fantastic, really, really good, but it is beat out by some of the thicker laptops out there that don't increase the weight that much, but have significant increases in performance. So if you're after the most gaming performance per pound, the Zephyrus G14 is not the top pick, interestingly enough. And when it comes to points per dollar, it's still very, very good at 4.98, but it's not quite, again, at the very top. It's still up there though. But when it comes to CPU performance, this is where the G14 really shines, especially considering its super thin and light profile. We get an insane Cinebench R20 score at 12,673, actually beating out the thicker Zephyrus G15, interestingly enough, and we did have slightly higher power limits on the G14, which doesn't make any sense. I think it's just a firmware issue here, but it's kind of crazy the level of performance we're getting from the G14. In Cinebench R20, we got 4,961, again beating out the Zephyrus G15. For Cinebench R20 points per pound, we are off the charts at 1,341. So if you're looking for a machine that has crazy CPU performance in a thin and light chassis, and the crazy thing is, even though this is such crazy amount of performance per pound, we're also getting really, really good performance per dollar at 3.31, the second highest I've ever tested. Now for our Handbrake 4K render time, we got 8 minutes and 32 seconds, which is phenomenal for something so thin and light. Now when it comes to my dual load stress test, thermals on this laptop really struggle unless you tweak it just a little bit. In last year's model, a lot of people disabled turbo boost on the CPU to reduce temperatures. You don't have to do that this year. What you can do instead is go into the Armory crate, go into manual mode, and just set the power limit for the short and long for the CPU to 35 watts, and take a look at the results of this stress test. You can see that the default fan profiles just push the temperatures of the CPU and GPU to very high temperatures, to the point even where we saw thermal throttling on the GPU. Now when I took the bottom of this laptop off, you can clearly see that this is a shared heat pipe design with the 3 main heat pipes being shared between the CPU and GPU. So this means that if we increase the temperature on the CPU, the GPU is also going to be increased on its temperature as well. Now this is kind of a two-edged sword because it allows the CPU to use the whole cooling of the entire laptop, both sides of the fans, all of the outtakes, which is why we have such crazy CPU performance in this laptop. But the downside is because the CPU is taking so much juice, it's just ramping up the temperatures so much that it's increasing the temperature of the GPU as well. So simply by reducing the power limit on the CPU in Armory Crate to 35 watts for the short and long power limits, I was able to see drastic temperature decreases. It is a crazy difference actually. Like look at the best case versus worst case. Like in the turbo and performance mode, we saw 85 and 83 degrees on the GPU and 94 and 96 degrees on the CPU. That is just straight thermal throttling for the most part. And just by simply adding a 35 watt power limit to the manual mode, we saw a drastic drop in temperatures. It was a 17-degree drop in temperatures from 93 Celsius to 76 degrees Celsius, and from 74 degrees Celsius to 67 degrees Celsius on the GPU. So it allows you to basically have an incredibly cool running machine simply by running max fans with a 35 watt limit to the CPU. But of course those fans are very loud at 59 decibels. So you're going to want to find the middle ground there, but simply by adding the power limit to the CPU, you're able to do that. You're able to tune the laptop to how you want it to run. Overall, I love that Asus has tuned this to have really, really high performance, but the temperatures are a bit high. So if you want to have ideal thermals on this machine, you'll want to set that 35 watt power limit to the CPU and run the sucker at max fans. You can also increase the power limit a bit if these temperatures are a bit low. 67 and 76 are insanely low. So if you're okay with them running a bit hotter, you can just increase the power limit maybe to 40 or 45, and you'll get very close to the peak performance of the machine without having nearly as high of temperatures. Taking a look at the performance, you can see that we actually had the best GPU performance, averaging 1401 for the GPU clock with this 35 watt power limit, and getting 3.52 gigahertz on the CPU still, despite having that lower power limit. So I think the 35 watt power limit range for the CPU is right around the optimal performance for the temperature generated of the machine. Now, when we take a look at the 1080p gaming benchmarks, you can see that we are getting some really good performance. You're going to be able to play basically all the games at ultra or high settings. Some of the games I would recommend turning down just a little bit so that you can increase and boost the frame rate a bit more. Now, when you compare the Zephyrus G14 versus other laptops on the market, the G14 simply does not put out as many frames per second. But the thing is, we're also only shooting for 144 Hz refresh rate on this laptop. So in the CPU-bound games, the esports titles, this laptop is gonna hit 144 FPS in a lot of those titles, which is gonna be 2 giant thumbs up from me. Now in GPU-bound games, that's where this laptop is going to do really well in some, and then in others, you're going to want to turn the settings down a bit. Just know that for the vast majority of games coming out right now, you're going to be able to play them on like high or ultra settings pretty much all the time for right now. And of course, this machine is going to be able to play VR games really well for the vast majority of VR headsets, though ultra high resolution VR headsets like the HP Reverb G2 and Pimax 8KX, you'll want to have a more powerful laptop than this one if you want to run those headsets at their full potential. Now, when we take a look at the 15 game benchmark average, you can see that we got 143 FPS in CPU bound games and 57 FPS in GPU bound games. So know that if you do go all the way up to a RTX 3080 with the SCAR 15 130 watt GPU, you get a nice bump up to 78 FPS, but you're still getting 57 FPS in the GPU bound games, which is still very playable. And when you consider just how thin and light the G14 is, it's really only the most demanding games where you might feel like the GPU and CPU could be upgraded a bit. Overall, this thing is clearly a great gaming laptop that will satisfy the vast majority of gamers' needs out there. But at the same time, this is clearly not the most performance per dollar that you can get. So if you're looking to get the most performance per dollar, you're gonna want to get a thicker machine that has a higher TDP and also potentially has a MUX switch, because this laptop cannot bypass Optimus unless you use an external display through the USB-C port. Now, when it comes to speakers, we get 82.8 decibels of sound out of this machine. That is absolutely freaking crazy. And here's the trick. If you open Dolby Access and go to the settings, you can set the EQ of the laptop. And if you hit it to be dynamically boosted, you get dramatically louder sound out of the speakers. Out of the box, it was only hitting about 78, 79 decibels. But once I hit dynamic boost, it boosted it up to 82.8 decibels of sound, which is just crazy loud for a laptop that is this thin and light. And when it comes to speaker qualities, we have some bass, we have decent mids, decent highs. I wouldn't say these speakers have incredible clarity, but they are really, really good all-around speakers that can get very loud. Now, when it comes to battery life, this thing absolutely crushes it. Now, in airplane mode at 50% brightness, I was able to estimate 16 hours of battery life. So if you're just taking notes in a college class, that's a perfect example of the kind of battery life you might be able to expect. Now, when it comes to web browsing, I was getting about 8.5 to 9 hours of use out of this thing. It's the best battery life of any laptop I've tested so far this year. And of course, when gaming, you're gonna kill the battery very quickly. Now, I really enjoyed the keyboard. I think it has a great layout, a great feel, decent travel, and the backlight in a dim environment is really, really good. But the problem still remains from last year's model that when you have the backlighting enabled in a medium or bright environment, it makes the keys actually harder to read, which is a really weird thing to say. So in a medium and bright environment, I just turn the keyboard backlight completely off. And then in a dim environment, you can turn the keyboard backlight up and it looks gorgeous. Though the brightness along all of the keys are not like perfectly even still. Now the trackpad works really great, but it is a little smaller than average. It didn't really bother me though while using it. Now this does have a fingerprint scanner on the power button and it worked really well for me. I never had to redo the fingerprint, but if it stops working for you or it's being finicky, I would say make sure your finger is dry and then also redo your fingerprint impression, and then hopefully it will improve its performance. But I mean, it worked 95, 98% of the time, every time for me. Now, when it comes to ports, on the left, we have a headphone mic port, USB-C with display port out and USB-C charging, an HDMI 2.0 port. Sadly, it's not HDMI 2.1. And then we have our power port. Now we have 4 exhausts going around the laptop, one on the left, 2 on the back, and 1 on the right, as well as a Kensington lock port, 2 USB-As, and then 1 more USB-C port that is not a display port. But we are missing an Ethernet port, no Thunderbolt support, and of course no SD card slot or HDMI 2.1. Overall, the ports are decent. It's up to you whether you think those ports will meet your needs. Arguably one of the biggest cons for the Zephyrus G14 is that the chassis itself can get quite warm, so warm in fact that it can be uncomfortable to have on your lap or type on if it's under full load. Now, if it's not under full load, it's not as big of a deal, but it still can get fairly warm even when it's under like a medium load. Now, if you want the chassis to be cooler to the touch, I recommend setting that 35 watt power limit to the CPU and then running the fans on maximum and using a pair of headphones. If that's not an option, you're just gonna have to deal with the heat. I'm sorry, that's the reality of it. Now, the wrist rests don't get that hot. It's really just the middle of the keyboard and the middle of the underside of the device that gets super hot. Now, another downside of this device is that there is no webcam, but you can use your smartphone as a webcam for free, and I'll have a tutorial on my channel about how to use your smartphone as a webcam in the near future, so just know that there is that option for you if you need it. Overall, the Zephyrus G14 is not for those of you that are looking for the most performance per dollar. This thing is all about having an extremely portable laptop, great battery life, premium feel, while still packing a crazy amount of performance. If you're tired of getting a super thin and light machine that just can't cut it, can't play the games you want to play, I mean, this thing will play basically every game out there at great frame rates as long as you're willing to tweak the settings a bit in the most demanding titles. And at the same time, it is still just so thin and light, and I mean, it's kind of unbelievably thin and light. It's an all-around very premium, great feeling package that just, it feels solid in the hand, it feels like a great investment, and as long as you can put up with the heat the chassis puts out and you're willing to tweak it, like I mentioned in the video, I think the vast majority of people will be super happy with the Zephyrus G14 in their backpack. Now, in terms of alternative machines that you can buy instead of the Zephyrus G14, let's say you want to spend around $2,000 or less. If you're okay carrying a bit more weight and a bit thicker machine, I do recommend the Zephyrus G15 or Aorus 15G over the G14. But it all depends on what you need. If you need a machine that is just super portable, super thin, super light, and still packs a punch, the G14 is probably the best laptop out there that fits in that category. Now, in terms of laptops that are under 4 pounds that still pack a punch, the MSI Stealth 15M, we've got the Acer Predator Triton 300. But see, the thing is, those laptops only have 4-core Intel CPUs, which to me just isn't cutting it. The Zephyrus G14 crushes those laptops into the dust because we have an 8-core CPU instead of a 4-core CPU, and it's still right around the same price point. Now, another couple alternatives would be the HP Omen 15Z and then the Electronics Max 15, though to get a competitive spec with the Max 15, you're gonna have to shell out a lot more money. Now, if you want to shop around and compare all these laptops as well as know when any of them are in stock, I did create an RTX 3000 series laptop comparison spreadsheet. Now, don't take the ratings too seriously in there, but just use them as a rough guide only to give you an idea of a laptop's performance. There's a link in the video description down below if you want to check it out. So that's it for my review of the Zephyrus G14. Now, if you enjoy my videos and you want to see more, it goes a long way if you like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell. I will see you in the next one. Brandon out. Huzzah.